Welcome to This Explainer. If you grew up learning that the American Civil War was just this straightforward, moral story of a virtuous North fighting an evil South, well, you actually missed the most unsettling and maybe the most dangerous part of the whole history. Today, we're examining the Civil War not just as a profound moral conflict, but as the violent climax of an economic Cold War that had been brewing for half a century. We're going to dive into the financial architecture behind slavery and really look at how a society can turn human beings into property, that property into credit, and that credit into enough political power to drag an entire nation into war. Okay, let's dive right into this. We've all seen the clean, compact history on the left, right? The North wanted to end slavery, the South wanted to preserve it, they fought, and the right side won. And sure, that's not entirely wrong, but it completely flattens reality. When you move past that basic textbook narrative and actually follow the money and the credit, that messy, complicated web on the right suddenly emerges. What we really find is an interconnected, transatlantic economic system entirely built on human collateral. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look beyond that textbook narrative. 2, we'll explore human beings as capital. 3, we'll untangle the transatlantic financial web. 4, we'll break down the economics of expansion. And finally, we'll look at the true price of emancipation. All right, Section 1, Beyond the Textbook Narrative. Let's peel back the layers of this national financial system. Now, before we look at a single ledger, we absolutely have to establish a clear boundary here. The roughly 4 million people held in bondage in 1860 were human beings. They had families, memories, and lives. They were not just numbers on a balance sheet. But following the money shows us just how ruthlessly efficient this crime was organized on a national scale. It was fundamentally a massive collision between two totally competing systems of wealth creation. Just look at this quote. The stakes were absolute. Whoever controlled the Western territories would control the political balance of the nation. The North and the South had two completely different visions for America's future, and both ruling classes understood that whichever side expanded its economic model westward would ultimately dictate federal law, tariffs, and the entire national economy. Moving on to Section 2, Human Beings as Capital. We're looking at a legal and credit system written directly onto human bodies. To really understand the absolute desperation of the Southern elite and why they were willing to literally tear the country apart, we have to look directly at the staggering concentration of wealth they were defending. Check out this number, $3.5 billion. In the currency of 1860, that was the estimated collective value of enslaved people in the United States. To put that massive figure into perspective, it rivaled the combined value of all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks at the time. All of them. Slaveholders were defending an enormous, unprecedented pool of capital. Abolition, to them, wasn't just some social change. It was asset confiscation on a scale the world had literally never seen. So the crucial point here is how this capital actually functioned in the banking sector. We all know what collateral is, right? It's property pledged to secure a loan. But in the antebellum economy, human beings were routinely used as this financial security. Take Louisiana's Citizens Bank, for instance. They built a massive mortgage portfolio deeply tied to sugar plantations, where loans were secured by both land and enslaved labor. And if a borrower defaulted, the human beings pledged as collateral were quite literally sold off to satisfy the bank's debt. Let's jump into Section 3, the transatlantic financial web. It's time to dismantle the myth of Northern innocence. We really need to let go of this comforting myth that the North stood totally outside this crime until it benevolently decided to step in and emancipate the enslaved. The wealth generated by forced labor absolutely did not stop at the southern border. Let's walk through this bloody supply chain step by step. Step 1, enslaved labor on southern plantations produces the raw cotton. Step 2, a northern merchant ships and transports those goods, collecting their commissions. Step 3, banks in New York or London finance the whole operation with credit, happily raking in the interest, while insurance firms charge premiums to protect the cargo, which tragically included human cargo. And finally, Step 4, British mills turn that raw cotton into highly profitable cloth. A consumer thousands of miles away might never see the whip in the fields, but the money they spent traveled right back down this exact chain. So just how dependent was the nation on this entire setup? Well, by 1860, Southern cotton accounted for roughly 60%. That's 3/5 of all United States exports. Cotton completely drove American commerce. It wasn't some side hustle or peripheral industry. It was the undeniable beating engine of the national and global market at the time. As our source material impartially points out, the North definitely contained powerful abolitionist movements, but it also contained businesses that profited from the exact same system they condemned, or, just chose not to see. Major New York banks and northern financiers benefited massively from the commerce created by enslaved labor. Profits from those cotton fields flowed straight into northern bank accounts and were constantly reinvested into things like railroads and real estate. The entire financial architecture of the country was completely complicit. Which brings us to Section 4, the economics of expansion. Let's look at how financial interests drove political brinksmanship. Let's move on and see how this all builds up. Because this economic engine was so massive and so entrenched, it heavily dictated national political policy. The fight wasn't initially about ending slavery where it already existed. It was a desperate, high-stakes battle over geographic expansion. Just look at this timeline. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise tries to draw a line on a map to balance free and slave states in the Senate. By 1828, the Tariff of Abominations taxes imports, squeezing Southern profits and sparking early threats of secession. Jump to 1850, and a new compromise forces Northerners to comply with an incredibly strict Fugitive Slave Act. Then, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, driven in part by the desire for a transcontinental railroad route, sparks actual guerrilla warfare. And finally, in 1857, the Dred Scott decision essentially shatters the idea of containment by protecting slaveholder property rights everywhere. Every single compromise just bought a little more time. None of them actually solved the underlying financial contradiction. So you might be wondering, why was the Republican Party's platform of merely containing slavery viewed by the South as an absolute existential threat? Well, just look at the financial realities. Intensive monocrop agriculture like cotton rapidly exhausted the soil. Planters literally needed continual expansion just to maintain production and pay off those massive debts we talked about. Plus, new territories meant new Senate seats and electoral votes. Without that geographic expansion, the South faced permanent political minority status. A Northern-dominated Congress could easily dictate tariffs, fund Northern infrastructure, and eventually squeeze the slaveholding class out of existence entirely. So for them, containment wasn't just a political loss, it was a declaration of long-term economic war. And that leads us into Section 5, the price of emancipation, the collapse of the system, and the aftermath. By 1860, trust between the two sides was completely gone. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with almost exclusively Northern support, Southern leaders felt the political war was lost, and secession rapidly followed. But once the shooting actually started, it was economic capacity that ultimately determined who could outlast who. If we compare their economic engines, the stark differences become glaringly clear. The North had this vast industrial base, an extensive railroad network, and a much larger free population. They could mobilize resources by creating a national banking system and selling war bonds to the public. The South, on the other hand, was entirely dependent on export agriculture and forced labor. As the Union blockade tightened up and production plummeted, the Confederacy resorted to just printing paper money to cover expenses, and that led to massive inflation that completely crippled their financial capacity. Now, the Confederacy did try to use its dominant asset as a weapon. It was a strategy known as King Cotton diplomacy. They figured if they withheld cotton, British mills would be forced to close, and London would have to intervene militarily to rescue the Southern economy. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They completely overestimated the power of a single commodity and underestimated how adaptable global markets actually are. Britain simply found new suppliers in places like India, Egypt, and Brazil. And on top of that, despite real economic pain and unemployment in British mill towns, the anti-slavery sentiment among the British public was so strong that there was just no political will to support a government founded to preserve human bondage. So, by 1865, the Confederate economy was totally exhausted, and that brutal system of forced labor finally collapsed. The 13th Amendment was ratified, legally erasing billions of dollars in claimed property overnight, with zero compensation to former slaveholders. But here is the stark economic reality that often disappears from the conclusion. Freed people entered liberty with almost no land, no capital, and no lasting protection. The immense wealth extracted from generations of their forced labor was never returned to the people who actually created it. This whole history offers us a pretty profound lesson. As our source material so powerfully puts it, A legalized crime is often more dangerous than a secret conspiracy because ordinary people can participate while believing they are merely doing their jobs. We don't need to look for some hidden room of evil masterminds to explain this horror. It was sustained by everyday politicians, merchants, insurance brokers, and bankers who were operating entirely legally within the accepted market structures of their time. It was public, it was highly profitable, and tragically, it was accepted as normal by far too many people. And that leaves us with a really necessary reflection. When an economy can grow that rapidly while its moral foundation completely rots, moral argument alone might not be enough to dismantle it. So looking closely at this historical financial architecture forces us to ask a tough question. What systems do we live inside today where profit teaches people not to look at the price someone else is being forced to pay? It's a heavy question, for sure, but it's one worth carrying with you long after this explainer ends.